They had already decided his future before he ever spoke. A teenager stood alone in court, accused unheard, and minutes away from losing everything. Then a quiet man in the back row remembered something no one else wanted to see. One forgotten camera, one moment, and a truth that could stop the verdict cold. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The courtroom felt sealed shut, as if the air itself had decided the outcome before anyone spoke. The teenager stood beside his public defender's shoulders, slightly hunched, hands clasped together at his waist so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. His eyes stayed on the floor, not from guilt, but from experience. He had learned long ago that looking up too much only invited more judgment. The defense table looked smaller than it should have, crowded by thin files and a lawyer whose suit had seen too many similar mornings. Across the aisle, the prosecutor stood with practiced ease. His voice was steady, confident, almost casual, as though he were listing items on a receipt instead of reciting the facts of a young life about to be altered. Assault at a convenience store, a security guard injured, surveillance footage unclear but suggestive, prior warning for loitering. Each phrase landed with dull precision. No raised voice, no anger, just certainty. The kind of certainty that rarely needed proof beyond pattern. The judge listened without interruption, hands folded, eyes neutral. He had heard cases like this before, too many to count. The words moved through the room, settled, and stayed. No one shifted, no one whispered. Even the wooden benches seemed to hold their breath. Behind the boy, his mother sat gripping the edge of the bench with both hands. Her fingers trembled despite her effort to keep still. She had dressed carefully that morning, choosing clothes she hoped looked respectful enough, invisible enough, safe enough. She had learned that respectability sometimes worked like armor, though not always. Her eyes never left her son's back. She knew this system. She knew how quickly it moved when it decided not to care. She had prayed not for mercy, but for pause. Just a pause, long enough for someone to actually see him. The defense attorney rose when it was his turn, clearing his throat once before speaking. His voice carried strain not from lack of preparation, but from the weight of knowing how little room he had. He spoke about inconsistencies, about unclear footage, about reasonable doubt. The words were correct, measured, and ultimately fragile. Each sentence felt like it had to climb uphill against gravity that had already chosen a direction. When he finished, he sat down without flourish, his shoulders sagging just slightly. Silence followed, the kind that stretches, then tightens. The judge glanced down at his notes. The prosecutor waited, hands folded. The boy swallowed once. His mother closed her eyes for a moment as if bracing for impact. Everyone in the room sensed it. This was the moment where things moved forward, because that was what they always did. This was where a life narrowed quietly, efficiently, without outrage. The verdict had not been spoken, but it hovered close enough to feel. Then from the back of the gallery, a chair shifted. Not loudly, not abruptly, just the soft scrape of wood against tile. The sound was so small, it barely registered, yet it cut through the stillness like a breath taken too late. Heads did not turn all at once, but attention bent toward it. The judge looked up. The prosecutor paused. The boy did not notice at first. Someone had moved, not to leave, not to interrupt. Just enough to be noticed. And in a room where everything felt finished, that quiet movement changed the shape of what came next. The judge's eyes lifted fully now, drawn not by noise but by instinct. Years on the bench had taught him to recognize the smallest disruptions, the moments when a case resisted closing neatly. He looked toward the back of the courtroom. So did the prosecutor, his expression tightening just slightly, as if annoyed by an interruption that had not yet announced itself. The boy still stared at the floor. He had learned not to follow movements that did not concern him. His world had narrowed to the space between his shoes and the edge of the defense table. That was all he allowed himself to see. Anything beyond that felt dangerous, hope especially. The man in the back row straightened his posture. He did not rush. He did not raise a hand. He simply sat upright, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on the front of the room. There was nothing dramatic about him. No tailored suit, no air of importance, just a quiet presence that felt deliberate, as though he had been listening more closely than anyone realized. The judge cleared his throat, a subtle sound that restored order without effort. He glanced once more at his notes, then back toward the gallery. His gaze lingered on the man for half a second longer than necessary. The judge was not sure why. Something about the timing, something about the stillness that followed the movement. The prosecutor resumed his stance, ready to continue, but the rhythm had shifted. The certainty that had filled the room moments earlier thinned just slightly. It was still there, but it no longer felt absolute. The air moved again. Someone in the audience adjusted their position. A breath escaped too loudly. Small signs that the room was no longer sealed shut. The boy's mother opened her eyes. She sensed it before she understood it. A change subtle but real. She lifted her head, her grip loosening on the bench. Her eyes searched the room, not knowing what she was looking for, only that something had interrupted the inevitable. For the first time since entering the courtroom, she allowed herself to wonder why. At the defense table, the public defender noticed it too. He had learned to read rooms the way sailors read weather, a shift in posture, a pause where none had existed. He straightened his papers, unsure whether this was false hope or something worth preparing for. He did not dare to believe yet. Belief had betrayed him too many times before. The judge folded his hands again, but his posture had changed. He was no longer leaning toward conclusion. He was waiting for something to either settle or surface. His eyes flicked once more to the back row. The man met his gaze calmly. No urgency, no challenge, just awareness. As if he knew that speaking too soon would fracture the moment rather than serve it. The prosecutor felt it now, a faint irritation creeping beneath his composure. Cases like this did not usually pause themselves. They moved forward on rails laid long before anyone entered the room. He shifted his weight, ready to prompt the judge to proceed. The boy finally lifted his eyes just a little. Not enough to meet anyone's gaze, enough to notice that no one was speaking, that the moment had stretched instead of snapped. His heart beat harder, confused by the delay. He did not understand what it meant, only that it felt different from every other silence he had known. In that brief suspension, the courtroom existed between outcomes, between what was expected and what was possible. No words had changed, no evidence had been added, and yet the certainty that once filled the space had cracked quietly, almost imperceptibly. All because someone in the back row had decided to sit up, and because of that, the verdict everyone expected did not arrive when it was supposed to. The judge inhaled slowly, then let the breath out through his nose. He glanced at the clock on the wall, then back to the courtroom, as if measuring whether time itself was pressing him forward. It was not. For the first time that morning, he did not feel rushed. Something unseen had placed its hand on the proceedings and asked them to wait. The prosecutor opened his mouth, then closed it again. He sensed the moment slipping out of alignment, and he did not yet know why. The defense attorney felt it too, a strange tightening in his chest, like the first drop of rain before a storm. He leaned forward, slightly alert, now no longer resigned. The boy stood frozen, suspended between fear and something he did not dare to name. His mother held her breath, afraid that any movement might break whatever fragile pause had entered the room. In the back row, the man remained still. He had not spoken. He had not announced himself, yet his presence now carried weight, as if a door had quietly unlocked behind the courtroom walls. The judge lifted his eyes again, this time with intention. The case was not over. Not yet. His name was Marcus Hale, 17 years old, born and raised 3 blocks from the convenience store that would later change his life. The neighborhood had a reputation that traveled faster than the people who lived there. Cracked sidewalks, flickering streetlights, schools that cycled through teachers as quickly as they cycled through hope. Marcus learned early that keeping his head down mattered, not because it made life easier, but because it made life quieter. He lived with his mother in a small apartment above a closed laundromat. Every morning before school, he took out the trash, checked the locks, and made sure the windows were shut tight. His mother worked long shifts cleaning offices downtown. She came home exhausted, her hands rough, her voice softer than it used to be. Marcus learned how to cook simple meals, learned how to stretch groceries, learned how to be present without being in the way. He was not a perfect student. Math frustrated him. Reading took time. Teachers described him as distracted, unmotivated, quiet. None of them described him as dangerous. The convenience store sat on the corner of Maple and 6th. Bright lights, faded posters, a place Marcus had walked into dozens of times without incident, sometimes for milk, sometimes for bread, sometimes just for a soda when the apartment felt too small. The clerks knew him by face, not by name. He paid in cash. He did not linger. To Marcus, it was just a store, not a line between freedom and a cell. That night, he walked in with $5 folded carefully in his pocket. His mother had asked him to pick up bread on his way home. He pushed the door open, the bell chiming overhead, and stepped into the familiar hum of refrigerators and low music. He grabbed a loaf and a cheap drink, then paused near the snack aisle, counting the change in his head. That was when he felt it, the weight of eyes on his back. The security guard stood near the counter, arms crossed, gaze fixed. He was older, heavier, wearing a badge that caught the fluorescent light. Marcus felt his shoulders tighten. He had felt this before. That unspoken question. What are you doing here? Marcus kept his eyes forward, moved toward the register, then stopped when the guard spoke. Don't hang around. The words were not loud, not aggressive, but they were sharp. Marcus turned slightly confused. He said he was paying. His voice stayed low, respectful. The guard stepped closer, too close. He repeated himself slower this time. Customers nearby glanced over, then quickly away. No one wanted to be involved. Marcus felt heat rise in his chest. He took a step back. The guard followed. Between the aisles, the space narrowed, shelves on both sides, no room to pass. Marcus said he was leaving. The guard blocked his path. Words overlapped, still not shouted, just firm, accusatory. Marcus felt trapped. His hand brushed the shelf as he shifted his weight. The guard reached out. What happened next unraveled in seconds. A push, a stumble, someone yelled. The guard fell hard. His shoulder striking the floor, bottles rattled, the bell at the door chimed as someone ran out. Marcus froze. Then hands grabbed him from behind. Someone forced him to the ground. When the police arrived, the scene was already decided. The guard was hurt. Marcus was restrained. No one asked who spoke first. No one asked who blocked whose path. The report wrote itself. Marcus lay face down on the cold tile, one cheek pressed against the floor, the smell of spilled soda sharp in his nose. A knee pinned his back. His hands were pulled behind him, metal biting into his wrists. He tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. Every sound he made seemed to confirm something he did not understand, as if his fear itself was proof. The security guard sat up slowly, clutching his shoulder, groaning loud enough for everyone to hear. Someone handed him a bottle of water. Someone else asked if he was all right. No one asked Marcus the same question. A clerk pointed toward him, explaining what had happened in short, certain sentences. The story moved quickly now, gaining speed with each retelling. The guard had been doing his job. The teenager had gotten aggressive. There had been a warning. There had been resistance. Marcus stared at the scuffed floor tiles, each one cracked in a familiar pattern he had never noticed before. He wanted to explain. He wanted to say he had tried to leave. He wanted to say he felt blocked in. But every time he opened his mouth, a voice spoke over him. Firm. Official. Uninterested. When the police lifted him to his feet, the cuffs tightened. The guard pointed toward a spot on the floor, describing the moment of impact. The officers nodded. They did not ask Marcus where he had been standing. They did not ask why the argument started. They asked for his name, his age, his address. The questions felt heavy, like weights being added one by one. Outside, the night air was cool. Blue and red lights washed over the storefront painting, the windows in colors that made everything look unreal. A small crowd had gathered across the street, phones out whispering. Marcus searched their faces for something familiar. He found nothing. At the station, the process continued. Photos, fingerprints, a holding room that smelled of disinfectant and old fear. Marcus sat on a bench, arms wrapped around himself, trying to slow his breathing. He thought about his mother, still at work, unaware. He thought about the bread sitting on the counter back at the store. He thought about how quickly a normal night had slipped away. An officer came in with paperwork. The words sounded distant. Assault, injury, charges pending. Marcus nodded because nodding felt safer than speaking. When they finally let him make a call, his hands shook so badly he almost dropped the phone. His mother's voice cracked when she heard him. She asked what happened. He said he did not know how to explain it yet. By the time Marcus was released into her care, the narrative had hardened. A report filed, statements taken, a guard injured in the line of duty. A teenager with a record now forming behind his name. The case moved forward, not because it had been understood, but because it had been labeled. In the days that followed, Marcus replayed the moment again and again. The aisle, the blocked path, the hand reaching out. He wondered what he could have done differently. He wondered if it would have mattered. No one from the store called to ask. No one from the crowd came forward. The story that had formed that night moved on without him. And when the court date arrived, Marcus walked into the courtroom carrying the weight of a version of himself he did not recognize, already defined by a moment no one had bothered to question. In the weeks before the hearing, Marcus tried to return to his routine, but nothing fit the way it used to. School felt louder. Hallways felt narrower. Teachers looked at him differently once his name appeared on an attendance sheet, followed by a pause. Whispers traveled faster than facts. He stopped raising his hand. He stopped staying after class. He learned how to disappear in plain sight. At home, his mother worked more hours, not because she wanted to, but because lawyers were not free and time off was dangerous. She tried to stay strong in front of him, but at night Marcus heard her crying through the thin apartment walls. That sound stayed with him longer than the night in the store. It made the charge feel heavier, like it belonged to both of them now. Marcus replayed the moment constantly. Not the fall, but the seconds before it. The aisle, the guard's body blocking his path, the feeling of being watched. He wondered if he should have dropped the bread and walked out sooner. He wondered if keeping his voice calm had mattered at all. Each question led nowhere. Friends stopped coming by. Some parents did not want their kids involved. Others simply did not know what to say. Marcus understood. Silence was safer. Silence meant no risk. When the court date arrived, Marcus wore his best shirt. His mother adjusted the collar hands, lingering longer than usual. On the bus ride downtown, he stared out the window, watching the city move like it always had, indifferent to what was about to happen to him. Inside the courthouse, everything felt official and final. Polished floors, heavy doors, people who did not know his name but would decide his future. Marcus took his place beside his lawyer and lowered his eyes, preparing himself for what he believed was inevitable. No one had defended him that night, and he had learned not to expect it now. The prosecution began with confidence, not urgency. There was no need to rush when the story already aligned so neatly with expectation. The prosecutor stood, adjusted his jacket, and spoke as if guiding the room through something already agreed upon. He outlined the charge with clean language and controlled pacing. Assault resulting in injury, a security guard performing his duties, a teenager who became confrontational. The words flowed smoothly, polished by repetition. Witness statements were introduced next. A cashier, a customer near the drinks aisle, another customer near the door. Each account overlapped just enough to sound credible, while remaining vague enough to avoid contradiction. They described raised voices, sudden movement, a fall. None could clearly say who initiated contact. None described the moments before the escalation. Yet together, their statements were presented as reinforcing one another. The prosecutor used the same phrase more than once, careful and deliberate. Unclear, but consistent. Then came the security footage. The screen lit up. Grainy images played from an overhead angle. Bodies moved between shelves, a blur of motion, a sudden collapse, the guard on the floor, Marcus stepping back. The video froze at key moments, the prosecutor narrating what could not be seen. He did not claim the footage showed intent. He did not need to. He explained that intent could be inferred from behavior, from reaction, from context. The camera, he said, captured enough. The guard was called to testify. He spoke with assurance, his voice steady, his posture practiced. He described noticing Marcus loitering, described approaching him calmly, described feeling threatened when Marcus responded defensively. He spoke about training, about protocol, about how quickly situations could escalate when young men felt challenged. He emphasized his injury, the pain, the recovery. The room listened. Authority carries weight, especially when it sounds reasonable. Marcus sat still as his name was spoken again and again, always paired with descriptors that flattened him into an outline. The teenager, the suspect, the individual. His lawyer glanced at him briefly, then back to his notes. He knew what was happening. Nothing in the testimony definitively proved Marcus intended harm, but everything suggested it. Suggestion was enough. The prosecutor began layering context. Prior warning for loitering, not a charge, just a note. But it entered the record quietly like a stain. The neighborhood was mentioned next, not explicitly condemned, just referenced. A high crime area, a place where guards needed to be vigilant. The implication hovered without being stated. Marcus's reaction was framed as excessive, defensive posture, quick movement, failure to comply immediately. The defense attorney stood to object at one point, challenging the framing of behavior as intent. The judge allowed him to speak, but the momentum was not on his side. He questioned the witnesses, carefully pointing out uncertainty gaps, the lack of direct evidence. He emphasized that unclear did not mean incriminating, that consistency without clarity could still be wrong, but each push met resistance. The witnesses did not contradict themselves. The footage did not contradict the narrative strongly enough. The guard remained composed. The prosecutor leaned back, patient. Marcus's background hung in the room like an unspoken exhibit. His silence was interpreted as distance, his stillness as detachment. The case moved forward not by proving guilt, but by making innocence feel unlikely. This was not a search for truth. It was a confirmation of expectation. And Marcus was losing ground with every reasonable-sounding word. As the prosecution rested, the courtroom carried a strange sense of completion, as if something important had already been settled without being spoken aloud. The story now had edges, not sharp enough to cut, but defined enough to hold shape. The judge nodded slowly, absorbing the presentation. The jury seated quietly had heard enough to form impressions, even if they did not yet realize it. Marcus's defense attorney rose again, this time with the weight of imbalance pressing visibly on his shoulders. He began where he had to, not where he wanted to. He reminded the court that no witness had actually seen Marcus strike first. He repeated that the footage did not show the beginning of the encounter. He emphasized that fear and confusion could look like aggression when filtered through expectation. His words were careful, precise, and increasingly fragile as they moved through the air. He questioned the cashier about distance and timing. The cashier admitted she had been focused on the register. He asked the customer near the door if he had heard the first exchange of words. The man said no. He asked another customer whether she had seen the guard step into Marcus's path. She hesitated, then said she could not be sure. Each answer chipped away at certainty, but never enough to expose a clear truth. Uncertainty piled up without direction. The guard returned to the stand for cross-examination. The defense attorney asked about training and de-escalation, asked whether blocking a path could escalate tension, asked whether physical contact had occurred before the fall. The guard answered confidently, but his responses leaned on generalities. He spoke about perceived threat, about instinct, about reacting in the moment. The defense attorney pressed, but authority has a way of closing ranks around itself. Throughout it all, Marcus remained seated, hands folded, eyes forward. He wanted to speak. He wanted to explain the feeling of being cornered, the sudden panic, the moment his body reacted before his thoughts could catch up. But he knew this was not how the system worked. His voice was filtered through others, reduced to fragments and summaries. When he shifted in his chair, the movement felt too loud. The prosecutor objected selectively, always calmly, always with justification. The judge sustained some objections, overruled others. The rhythm favored the side that already carried momentum. Every small concession felt earned. Every pushback felt uphill. Marcus's prior warning resurfaced again, this time framed as context rather than accusation. The defense attorney objected. The judge allowed it to stand, reminding the court that it was not a charge, only background. Background had a way of becoming foreground without anyone noticing. The neighborhood was referenced once more. Not named, just described. High calls, frequent incidents. The implication settled quietly among the jurors. Marcus felt it land on him like a label he could not peel off. By the time the defense rested, the case had not proven Marcus guilty beyond doubt, but it had made doubt feel unreasonable. The scales did not tip sharply. They leaned gradually under the weight of assumption. This was not a battle of facts against lies. It was facts against framing, and framing was winning. As the judge called for a brief pause, the courtroom settled into a quieter, heavier state. Nothing more needed to be said for the weight of the case to be felt. The pieces had been arranged carefully, not to reveal what truly happened, but to support what everyone expected had happened. Marcus could feel it in the way eyes no longer searched for answers, only confirmation. His lawyer leaned toward him and whispered a few words meant to reassure, but Marcus barely heard them. He was watching the jury now, studying faces the way he had learned to study adults growing up. Some avoided looking at him, others looked briefly, then away. No one looked confused. That scared him more than anger ever could. The assumptions had done their work quietly. A guard injured meant authority violated. Grainy footage meant suspicion allowed. A warning meant pattern. A neighborhood meant risk. Each detail alone was harmless. Together they built a version of Marcus that did not need to be proven. It only needed to be accepted. Marcus's mother sat behind him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had followed every word, every pause, every objection. She understood what was happening, even if she did not know the legal terms for it. She knew the story being told was not about her son as a person, but about a type of person the system believed it already understood. Her chest ached with the knowledge that love and truth were not the same as evidence. When the judge returned his attention to the room, his expression was neutral, professional, unreadable. He thanked both sides. He acknowledged the clarity of the arguments presented. Clarity. The word echoed strangely in Marcus's mind. Nothing about this felt clear to him at all. The case now sat in a narrow space between law and assumption, where proof was optional, and expectation carried more weight than memory. The outcome had not yet been spoken, but it felt close. Too close. Marcus lowered his gaze again, bracing himself. He had done everything he was told to do, stayed calm, stayed quiet, trusted the process. And yet the process seemed to be moving forward without him. What no one in the room realized yet was that the case they believed was complete was missing something essential. Not evidence, perspective. And that missing piece was sitting quietly in the back row, waiting for the right moment to stand. Keanu Reeves sat in the last row of the courtroom, close to the wall, where the light from the tall windows softened before it reached him. He wore a dark jacket worn at the edges and simple shoes that made no sound when he shifted his feet. There was nothing about his posture that invited attention. He had not come expecting to matter. He was there because a notice had arrived weeks earlier, informing him he had been present at a convenience store on the night of an incident and might be called as a witness if needed. At the time, it had seemed routine, a formality, something that would likely never come up. He had not known the case involved a teenager. He had not known the charge carried the weight it did. He had certainly not known that the morning would feel this heavy. From the moment proceedings began, Keanu listened, not passively, not distracted. He listened the way he always did when people told stories about moments they believed were finished. His hands rested loosely in his lap. His eyes moved slowly, deliberately from speaker to screen to witness stand. He did not interrupt. He did not whisper. He did not lean forward to be seen. He simply absorbed. As the prosecutor spoke, something faint stirred in his memory. Not the words themselves, but the tone. The confidence with which the security guard's actions were described. The emphasis on reaction rather than beginning. Keanu's brow did not tighten. His face did not change. But inside he felt the subtle pull of recognition, the way a half-remembered image asks to be completed. When the store layout was described, Keanu pictured it instantly. The narrow snack aisle, the end cap display with discounted chips stacked unevenly, the refrigeration units humming near the back wall. He remembered where he had been standing that night, near a promotional rack scanning labels absent-mindedly. He remembered because it had been such an ordinary moment. Ordinary moments tend to stay intact. The footage began to play. Grainy, elevated, partial. Keanu watched closely. He noted what it showed, but more importantly, what it did not. The angle skipped the start. The camera cut off just before the interaction tightened. The prosecutor spoke over the footage, filling in the missing space with interpretation. Keanu felt something settle uneasily in his chest. He remembered the guard's voice, not loud, not calm either, sharp around the edges. He remembered how quickly the distance between the guard and the boy had closed. He remembered thinking briefly that the guard was standing too close. At the time, it had not felt like something worth intervening in. People spoke sharply to each other in stores all the time. It seemed like nothing, until it wasn't. As the guard testified, Keanu studied him without judgment. He listened to the certainty, the training, the protocol, and yet the words did not align with the image forming more clearly now in Keanu's mind. The guard described approach and reaction. Keanu remembered presence and pressure. He remembered the way the boy's shoulders had drawn inward, the way his feet had shifted backward, not forward. Keanu remained still. To anyone watching, he was just another observer. But inside, something had shifted direction. A memory that had once been insignificant was now standing up, insisting on being acknowledged. He did not yet know what he would do with it. He only knew that what he was hearing did not fully match what he had seen. As the testimony continued, Keanu's attention sharpened, narrowing in a way that felt almost physical. Each new detail acted like a brushstroke, filling in gaps around a memory he had not known was incomplete. He replayed the night in his mind not as a single moment, but as a sequence. The entrance, the bell over the door, the quiet hum of the store. He remembered standing near the display, glancing up only because the guard's tone had cut through the background noise. Not loud enough to alarm, but firm enough to register. The prosecutor's words flowed on, but Keanu began to separate language from reality. He noticed how phrases were used to smooth uncertainty, how pauses were filled with assumptions. When the phrase unclear but consistent was repeated, Keanu felt the weight of it, consistent with what he wondered, with the footage, or with the expectation of how a situation like this was supposed to unfold. He glanced briefly toward the defense table. The teenager sat motionless, smaller than Keanu had expected. Shoulders drawn, eyes lowered. There was nothing aggressive about him now. Keanu tried to reconcile that image with the version being described. He could not. The memory pressed harder. He remembered the boy's face in the store, the flicker of confusion when the guard spoke, the hesitation before he responded. That hesitation mattered. It was the part missing from the story being told. Keanu shifted slightly in his seat, careful not to draw attention. He did not want to interrupt the flow prematurely. He knew how fragile moments like this could be. He had spent a lifetime watching how stories changed, depending on who told them first. He also knew that speaking too soon could cause people to stop listening altogether. The store layout was referenced again. A diagram appeared briefly on a screen. Keanu traced it with his eyes. He remembered where the guard had stood, how he had blocked the aisle, almost without realizing it. He remembered thinking that the space looked too tight for comfort. The camera angle being discussed now did not include that space. It never had. The guard answered another question, confident, practiced. Keanu listened carefully for hesitation for nuance. He heard none. But certainty, Keanu knew, did not always equal accuracy. Sometimes it simply meant a story had been told often enough to feel complete. Keanu's hands tightened slightly in his lap. He had come prepared to be a footnote, a background witness who might confirm being present and nothing more. He had not expected to carry something this important. He had not expected that a moment he barely noticed at the time would now sit at the center of a young man's future. He looked back at the judge. The judge listened intently, but within the structure already laid out. Keanu understood that structure well enough. Courts moved forward unless given a reason to stop. Silence was interpreted as agreement. Keanu felt the weight of that silence settle on him. The memory was no longer vague. It was clear enough to matter. And for the first time since the hearing began, Keanu understood why he had been sitting in that back row all along. Keanu took a slow breath, careful to keep his face neutral. Years in public life had taught him how easily attention could distort intention. He did not want to become a distraction. He wanted the truth to remain the focus, even if no one else had realized yet that it was incomplete. He thought again about that moment in the store, how ordinary it had seemed at first, how quickly it had slipped from his mind once the situation appeared resolved. He remembered leaving shortly after paying for his items, the night air cool against his face as he stepped outside. He had not known police would arrive minutes later. He had not known a report would be written. He had not known that a teenager would be pulled into a system that rarely slowed down once it began moving. Now, sitting in the courtroom, Keanu understood how fragile the line between memory and consequence could be. A moment overlooked did not disappear. It simply waited for the cost to be revealed. The judge's voice brought him back to the present. Proceedings were moving toward conclusion. The case was closing in on itself, tightening around the version of events that had been most convenient to accept. Keanu felt a quiet urgency rise, not panic, but responsibility. The kind that settles in the chest and does not leave. He looked once more at the teenager. Marcus had not looked back. He seemed braced, prepared for something he believed he could not change. Keanu recognized that posture. He had seen it in many places, in many people long before fame complicated his life. It was the posture of someone who had learned that speaking often made things worse. Keanu shifted forward slightly in his seat. Not enough to draw notice, just enough to signal a decision forming. He did not know exactly how he would speak yet, or when. He only knew that remaining silent would allow a false completeness to stand. And that, he realized, was something he could not live with. As the hearing continued, Keanu's memory stopped drifting and began sharpening, as if something inside him had finally decided that this moment mattered. It was no longer a collection of impressions. It became sequence, order, cause before effect. He replayed the night, again slower this time, anchoring himself to details that had seemed insignificant then, but felt heavy now. He remembered the guard approaching first, not responding, approaching. The guard had stepped away from the counter with purpose, not urgency, moving directly toward the aisle where the boy stood. Keanu remembered noticing it because it had felt unnecessary. The boy had not been loud, had not drawn attention. He was standing still, bread tucked under one arm, eyes down, counting change in his hand. Keanu remembered the aisle narrowing, shelves stacked, close boxes jutting out unevenly. He remembered thinking there was barely enough room for two people to pass comfortably. The guard entered that space anyway. That was the moment that stuck, now the moment missing from every description spoken in court. The guard did not wait near the register. He did not call out from a distance. He closed the gap. Then came the blocking. Keanu saw it clearly now. The guard had shifted his body sideways casually, as if unconsciously placing himself between the boy and the path out of the aisle. It was not dramatic, not aggressive in the way people expected aggression to look, but it was decisive. It removed an option. It turned a neutral interaction into a confined one. The boy stepped back. Keanu remembered that distinctly. A half step, then another. His shoulders angled inward, his eyes lifted briefly, not in challenge, but in uncertainty. Keanu remembered thinking the boy looked confused, maybe even embarrassed. That detail mattered more than anything else now. The boy did not advance. He retreated. There was a pause then, a silence that lasted no more than a second or two, but felt longer in memory. No shouting, no sudden movement, just stillness. Keanu remembered the hum of the refrigerator behind him, the faint buzz of lights overhead. That pause never appeared in the footage. It never appeared in testimony. It was the space where intent could be seen if anyone had bothered to look. The guard spoke again. Keanu could not recall the exact words, but he remembered the tone. Firmer, sharper. Not loud, but edged. The boy's mouth opened, as if to respond. Keanu remembered thinking the exchange was about to escalate, not because of what the boy was doing, but because of how little room he had been given. Then contact happened. Not a punch, not a swing. A hand reached out. A reflex met resistance. Bodies reacted faster than thought. The fall came after that, sudden and loud. Bottles rattled. Noise replaced nuance. And with that, the beginning disappeared. Keanu watched the footage again on the screen as the prosecutor referenced it. The video began where the truth ended. It showed the collapse, the chaos, the guard on the floor. It did not show the approach. It did not show the block. It did not show the pause. The story being told was not false. It was incomplete. And the part that mattered most had been left just outside the frame. Keanu felt the weight of that missing moment settle deeper as testimony continued. Each word spoken in the courtroom seemed to press against his memory, testing it, challenging it, forcing him to examine it from every angle. He was not imagining things. He was certain of that now. The sequence held. The order made sense. What troubled him was how easily that sequence had been replaced by something simpler, flatter, easier to accept. The prosecutor spoke again, pointing to the footage as the anchor of truth. The guard's fall, replayed on the screen, frozen at the moment his shoulder struck the tile. Keanu watched the frame carefully. He noted how the boy's body was angled away, not toward. How his feet were positioned as if retreating rather than advancing. Even here in the cropped version, the truth strained to be seen. Keanu's eyes drifted briefly to the jury. He saw concentration, not cruelty. These were not people eager to condemn. They were people being guided, shown where to look, and more importantly, where not to. The missing angle had not been hidden maliciously. It had been dismissed, labeled unclear, unimportant. And once dismissed, it had vanished from consideration entirely. The guard's testimony returned to protocol and instinct. He described sensing resistance. Keanu remembered sensing discomfort. Those two things could look identical from the outside, but they were not the same. One implied threat, the other implied fear. The courtroom language allowed for only one interpretation. Keanu thought again about that pause. That second of silence before everything tipped. He realized how rarely pauses survived retelling. Stories preferred motion, action, impact. Pauses required attention. They asked people to consider intention, not just outcome. And intention was harder to prosecute cleanly. He felt a quiet frustration build not toward anyone in particular, but toward the process itself. A process that relied on clarity, but often mistook completeness for truth. The footage had become the spine of the case, not because it showed everything, but because it showed something. Something dramatic, something definitive. The beginning, messy and human, had been left out because it did not fit neatly into a charge. Keanu shifted his gaze back to Marcus. The boy's posture had not changed, still folded inward, still guarded. Keanu recognized the expression now with painful clarity. It was not defiance, it was resignation. Marcus looked like someone who had learned that explaining himself rarely altered outcomes. The memory pressed again. Keanu remembered how quickly the guard had closed distance, how instinctively Marcus had stepped back, how the space between them had evaporated before either seemed fully aware of it. That was the truth the camera had missed, not because it was hidden, but because it was inconvenient. Keanu understood now that the story being told in the courtroom was clean because it had been edited, not deliberately falsified, but trimmed until it fit the shape everyone expected. And that realization carried weight because it meant something simple and unsettling. If he stayed silent, the truth would remain off camera forever. Keanu sat with that realization as the courtroom continued to move forward, each word spoken as if the foundation beneath it were solid. He understood now why the story felt finished to everyone else. The missing piece did not announce itself. It did not scream contradiction, it simply failed to appear. And absence, when it goes unchallenged, has a way of becoming invisible. He thought about how often truth depended on framing, how easily a camera angle could turn context into conclusion. The footage showed a fall, so the fall became the beginning. Everything before it was treated as background noise unworthy of scrutiny. Yet that was where the meaning lived, in the approach, in the block, in the moment where a young person realized he no longer had space to leave. Keanu felt the difference between what he remembered and what was being argued. The courtroom version described escalation initiated by resistance. His memory described escalation created by proximity and pressure. Those two versions led to radically different moral conclusions, even if the physical outcome looked the same. He noticed his own breathing slow as his mind settled on a single, uncomfortable truth. The system was not lying, it was simplifying. It was reducing a complex human moment into something manageable, something that fit neatly inside procedure. That simplification was not cruel by intention, it was efficient. And efficiency, Keanu knew, often came at the cost of people who did not have the power to interrupt it. The boy had not been aggressive, he had been overwhelmed. That distinction mattered, but it required someone to insist on it. Keanu glanced again at the judge. The judge was attentive fare within the structure presented to him. Keanu did not doubt his integrity, he doubted the completeness of what he had been given. Courts could only weigh what was placed on the scale. Anything left off might as well not exist. The guard's testimony concluded. The prosecutor seemed satisfied. The case was tightening toward resolution. Keanu felt the window narrowing, not dramatically, not suddenly, gradually. With every passing minute, the opportunity to correct the frame diminished. He understood now that memory was not enough. Certainty alone did not move courtrooms. It needed form, it needed permission. It needed to be spoken at the right moment in the right way. Keanu rested his hands on his knees and made a decision that settled quietly but firmly in his chest. He would not allow the truth to remain cropped simply because it was inconvenient. He would not let a pause be erased just because it did not translate cleanly to footage. The truth was not absent. It was simply waiting for someone to bring it back into the frame. The prosecutor returned to the podium with a practiced calm, as if tying off loose ends rather than opening new ground. He addressed the matter of surveillance coverage with the tone of someone explaining an already settled decision. The store, he said, had multiple cameras. Most were outdated. One angle had been reviewed and presented, another had been considered and dismissed. He did not linger on it. He did not need to. That camera, he explained, was positioned poorly. Low resolution, partially obstructed by shelving. The image quality inconsistent. Faces difficult to distinguish. Movements unclear. It had been deemed unreliable and therefore irrelevant. The phrase "not worth reviewing" was used once casually, as if closing a file. The judge nodded. This was not unusual. Courts filtered evidence all the time. Not everything captured by a camera was usable. Standards existed for a reason. Grainy footage could confuse more than clarify. The judge accepted the explanation without comment. Efficiency mattered. Time mattered. The defense attorney did not object, not because he agreed, but because he knew how fragile objections could be when unsupported by authority. He glanced down at his notes, then back up at the screen, weighing whether pushing the issue would weaken his standing. He had already challenged enough. The dismissed angle felt like a technical matter he could not afford to lose credibility over. The courtroom moved on, but Keanu did not. The moment the prosecutor mentioned the dismissed camera, Keanu felt the memory sharpen again, immediate and precise. He remembered that camera. He remembered exactly where it was mounted. Not high like the others, but lower near the corner above the end of the snack aisle. He remembered noticing it because the casing was cracked, the lens tilted slightly downward. It had not faced the register. It had not focused on the exit. It had faced the beginning. Keanu remembered standing near that aisle and glancing up briefly, seeing the small red light blinking. He remembered thinking the angle was awkward but useful. It captured proximity, space, the way people moved toward each other before anything happened. It was not designed to record impact. It was designed to record interaction. The prosecutor's description of it as unclear did not sit right with him. Poor resolution did not mean useless. Partial obstruction did not mean absence. Keanu knew what that camera saw because he had been standing in its line of sight. He knew it would have shown the guard approaching. He knew it would have shown the narrowing of space. He knew it would have shown the boy stepping back. The courtroom accepted the dismissal because no one in the room had a reason to challenge it. No one except Keanu. He shifted his gaze to the judge. The judge was already looking down, making a note, preparing to move forward. Keanu looked then at the defense attorney. The attorney's shoulders were tense. He was bracing for the next phase, already fighting a battle with limited tools. Keanu understood something with sudden clarity. If he remained silent, the system would not pause on its own. It would continue forward not out of malice, but momentum. The dismissed camera would remain dismissed. The beginning would remain off camera. The truth would stay cropped, not because it was hidden, but because no one insisted it mattered. Keanu felt the weight of that understanding settle into resolve. The choice was no longer abstract, it was immediate. As the hearing pressed on, Keanu felt time working against him in small, almost polite increments. The court did not rush, but it did not wait either. Each procedural step moved the case closer to conclusion, and with every step, the dismissed camera receded further into irrelevance. Keanu knew how easily that happened. Once something was labeled unusable, it stopped being questioned. It became invisible. He thought again about the prosecutor's words. Poor resolution, partial obstruction, not worth reviewing. None of those phrases meant the footage was false. They only meant it required attention, interpretation, patience, things the system often struggled to give when outcomes already felt obvious. Keanu remembered how that camera had caught the aisle from the side, not above. It would not have shown faces clearly, but it would have shown movement, direction, distance closing or widening. It would have shown whether someone advanced or retreated. In cases like this, those details mattered more than clarity of expression. They spoke to intent without needing to name it. He watched the defense attorney prepare his next notes, his pen moving quickly, his jaw set. Keanu could see the calculation behind his eyes. Every challenge had a cost. Push too hard on something deemed technical, and the court might lose patience. Keanu understood that hesitation. Lawyers learned to choose battles because the system punished those who fought everything. But Keanu was not bound by that calculus. He was not arguing law. He was holding memory. He looked again at Marcus. The boy's posture had not changed. Still small, still contained. Keanu felt the quiet injustice of it press on him. Marcus did not know about the camera. He did not know that a piece of his story existed somewhere on a hard drive, dismissed because it was inconvenient. He did not know that the beginning of his nightmare had been recorded and then set aside. The judge glanced up, scanning the room briefly, then returned to his notes. He did not know what he was missing. He could not. Judges could only weigh what was placed before them. Silence did not register as evidence. Keanu felt the moment narrowing again, like a door slowly closing. He had waited long enough to be certain. Now certainty demanded action. He did not feel fear. He felt responsibility, the kind that arrives quietly and does not leave room for excuses. He thought about how easily he could remain just another observer, how simple it would be to leave the courtroom later and tell himself he had not been called, that it was not his place. He knew that story too. He had heard it many times in many forms. It always sounded reasonable, but reasonable did not sit well with him anymore. Keanu straightened slightly in his seat, not yet standing, just aligning himself with the decision forming inside. He looked once more at the judge, then at the defense attorney. He did not need to catch their attention yet. He only needed to be ready when the moment came. The system was prepared to move on. Keanu was not. Keanu felt the quiet finality settling over the room, the kind that arrived not with a bang, but with a soft closing of files. The dismissed camera had already slipped into the past tense. It was something that had been considered reviewed and set aside. In the language of the court, that meant resolved. But in Keanu's mind, it remained unresolved. He could still see the angle clearly. The way the lens pointed slightly downward. The way it framed the aisle where space tightened before voices did. That camera had not been designed to capture drama. It had been designed to observe behavior. And behavior, Keanu knew, was often more honest before people realized they were being judged. He watched as the defense attorney finished a note and set his pen down. The attorney looked tired, not unprepared but worn by the sense that the most important part of the story had already slipped past him. Keanu understood that look. It was the look of someone fighting with incomplete tools. The judge shifted in his chair, preparing to guide the proceedings forward. Nothing in his expression suggested indifference. He appeared fair, attentive, bound by process. And that was exactly the problem. Process moved only on what it was given. Keanu realized then that silence was not neutral. Silence was consent. By saying nothing, he would be allowing the cropped version of the truth to stand as complete. The system would not question its own shortcuts. It never had. He felt a steady calm replace the tension in his chest. This was not about heroics or recognition. It was about refusing to let something important be erased simply because it was inconvenient to examine. Keanu did not yet rise. He waited, letting the moment come to him rather than forcing it. But the decision was made. The memory, the camera, the beginning of the story, all aligned into a single, unavoidable conclusion. If no one else was going to insist on looking at the part everyone skipped, then he would. And when he stood, it would not be to interrupt. It would be to complete the story. Keanu stood slowly, not abruptly, not with urgency. He rose the way someone does when they are certain of their footing. The quiet scrape of his chair against the floor carried farther than it should have, not because it was loud, but because the room had not expected movement anymore. Heads turned in fragments. First the judge, then the prosecutor, then a ripple through the gallery as recognition flickered from face to face. Keanu did not speak yet. He waited until he was fully upright, hands relaxed at his sides, posture open. He did not look toward the cameras or the spectators. His eyes went directly to the judge. "Your Honor," he said calmly, his voice steady and measured. "May I speak?" The courtroom shifted. A murmur moved through the benches, restrained but unmistakable. The name registered now, not as spectacle, but as surprise. The judge held up one hand, slightly restoring order with ease, though his own expression had changed. He studied Keanu for a moment, clearly recalibrating. The prosecutor straightened, alert. This was unexpected. Witnesses were called. They did not rise on their own. The judge leaned back just enough to consider the request. "Mr. Reeves," he said carefully, "you are not currently called as a witness." "I understand," Keanu replied immediately. "I'm not offering legal argument, and I'm not asking to testify formally. I only want to make a brief observation based on something I personally witnessed." The judge paused. He glanced toward the prosecutor, then back to Keanu. Procedure mattered. Relevance mattered. But so did discretion. The court was not deaf to context. "Keep it brief," the judge said at last. Keanu nodded once. No relief, no triumph, just acknowledgement. "I was present at the convenience store that night," he began. "I was near the snack aisle when the interaction occurred. I didn't know the details of this case until today, and I didn't realize it involved a teenager facing serious charges." Marcus lifted his eyes slightly now, confusion mixing with fear. His lawyer sat very still. Keanu continued, careful not to editorialize. "I've listened closely to the testimony and reviewed the footage shown. I want to be clear that I'm not disputing what the footage shows. The fall happened. The guard was injured. But the footage that's been presented doesn't reflect the beginning of the interaction as I remember it." The prosecutor shifted his weight, preparing to object, but Keanu did not push further yet. He allowed space between sentences, space for the words to settle. "I remember the guard approaching first," Keanu said. "I remember him entering the aisle and blocking the path. I remember the young man stepping back, not forward." There was a pause before any physical contact occurred. The courtroom was silent now, not murmuring, listening. Keanu kept his tone neutral. He was not accusing. He was describing. "There was another camera," he added gently, "mounted lower-angled toward the start of that aisle. I remember noticing it because of where I was standing. I understand it was dismissed as unclear, but that camera would have captured the beginning, not the end." He looked back at the judge, steady and respectful. "I'm not asking the court to draw conclusions based on my memory alone," Keanu said. "I'm only asking that the overlooked camera angle be reviewed so the court can see whether it aligns with what I witnessed." He stopped there. No demand, no flourish, just a request placed carefully into the silence. And for the first time since the hearing began, the room did not feel certain of what came next. The silence that followed Keanu's words was different from the silences that had come before. It was not heavy with inevitability. It was cautious, alert, as if the room itself had leaned forward without realizing it. The judge did not respond immediately. He studied Keanu with a measured expression, weighing more than just the request. He was weighing credibility, motive, and consequence. This was not a witness seeking attention. This was someone who had waited until the very last moment, who had chosen precision over interruption. The prosecutor cleared his throat softly. "Your Honor," he began, careful not to sound dismissive, "the camera Mr. Reeves is referring to was reviewed during discovery. It was excluded due to quality issues. The footage is grainy and partially obstructed. It does not clearly depict faces or contact." Keanu did not react. He did not argue. He simply waited. The judge nodded slowly, acknowledging the point, then turned back to Keanu. "Mr. Reeves, are you saying that camera would show something materially different from what we've already seen?" Keanu answered without hesitation, but without certainty he could not prove. "I'm saying it would show the start of the interaction, the approach, the distance closing, the pause before the fall. Whether that changes the court's interpretation is not for me to say, but it would show more than what has been presented." Marcus's lawyer leaned forward now, unable to remain passive any longer. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "the defense was not provided with usable footage from that angle. If there is material that captures the initiation of contact, it's directly relevant to intent." The prosecutor's jaw tightened slightly. "With respect," he replied, "we cannot reopen evidence every time a memory differs from recorded material." Keanu met the prosecutor's gaze briefly, not in challenge, but in calm acknowledgement. "I'm not asking the court to accept my memory over evidence," he said. "I'm asking the court to look at evidence that hasn't been considered fully." That distinction landed. The judge rested his elbows lightly on the bench, fingers interlaced. He looked at the screen where the footage had played earlier. He looked at the guard seated now, with his arms folded. He looked at Marcus standing quietly beside his attorney, trying not to hope. "Mr. Reeves," the judge said slowly, "you understand that if we review this footage, and it adds nothing, we will have lost time." "Yes, Your Honor," Keanu replied. "I do. And you're willing to stand by your observation under that risk?" Keanu nodded once. "Yes." The judge sat back, considering. Courts were built on procedure, but they were also built on judgment. The line between the two was often thin. He glanced again at the prosecutor, then at the defense attorney, then finally back to Keanu. The request had been made properly, calmly, respectfully, without pressure. What unsettled the room was not who had made it. It was how reasonable it was. The judge exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. "Let me see that camera," he said at last. And just like that, the direction of the case shifted. The words hung in the air longer than anyone expected. "Let me see that camera." They did not sound dramatic. They were not delivered with authority, meant to impress. They were spoken like a practical decision, almost routine. And yet they landed with the force of a door opening where no door had existed moments before. The courtroom reacted in quiet ways, A subtle shift in posture, a collective breath released. The murmur that followed was quickly silenced by the judge's raised hand, but the energy had already changed. What had felt finished now felt unfinished again. Marcus felt it before he understood it. His chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with something unfamiliar, possibility. He did not look at Keanu, unsure whether he was allowed to. He stared straight ahead, afraid that acknowledging hope might cause it to disappear. His mother's hands trembled in her lap. She pressed them together, grounding herself, afraid to move, afraid to interrupt whatever fragile turn the moment had taken. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. This was not the time to fall apart. The prosecutor nodded stiffly already, signaling to a clerk. He did not argue further. He did not protest. He understood the risk of resisting a reasonable request once the judge had accepted its relevance. His confidence had not vanished, but it had tightened, constrained by a new variable he could no longer control. Keanu remained standing until the judge nodded toward him, indicating he could sit. He did so quietly, without acknowledgement, returning to the back row as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. He did not look around. He did not look at Marcus. He had said what needed to be said. The judge addressed the court, explaining the brief delay. Procedure would be followed. The footage would be retrieved. No assumptions would be made yet. The words sounded ordinary, but their meaning was not. The case was no longer moving forward blindly. It was turning back to look. And for the first time since Marcus had entered the courtroom, the truth was being given room to step into the light. The judge did not speak right away. He leaned back slightly in his chair, hands resting on the arms, eyes focused somewhere beyond the courtroom walls. It was the kind of pause that carried weight, not hesitation, but calculation. Everyone in the room felt it. This was not a break for thought alone. This was a moment where direction could still be chosen. The prosecutor rose carefully, as if stepping onto thin ice. His objection was measured, respectful, wrapped in procedure rather than resistance. He acknowledged Mr. Reeves's presence, acknowledged his sincerity, but he cautioned against reopening evidence based on recollection alone. He reminded the court of efficiency, of precedent, of the risk of confusion. His voice never rose. It did not need to. Confidence still lived there, though it now had edges. Before the judge could respond, the defense attorney stood. This time, there was no hesitation. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady but urgent, "this is not speculation. This is an eyewitness who was physically present at the start of the interaction. The footage we've seen begins after the critical moment. If there is video that captures what initiated contact even imperfectly, the defense has a right to have it reviewed." The words hung in the air. Not dramatic, just correct. Marcus watched all of this without moving. His hands were still clasped in front of him, but they no longer felt numb. His heart beat loudly enough that he wondered if others could hear it. He had learned to be careful with hope. Hope had embarrassed him before. Hope had a way of making disappointment sharper. So he stayed still, eyes forward, refusing to react to anything until it became undeniable. Behind him, his mother leaned back slightly and pressed her palms together. She did not pray out loud. She did not move her lips. She simply closed her eyes and held her breath as if the air itself might disturb whatever fragile balance had formed. The judge listened to both sides without interruption. His gaze shifted from the prosecutor to the defense attorney, then briefly to Keanu, seated once again in the back row. The judge understood something important now. This was not an attempt to sway the court through reputation. This was not a spectacle. Keanu Reeves had not announced himself. He had not demanded attention. He had spoken only when silence would have completed an incomplete story. Eyewitness testimony carried weight, especially when it concerned evidence not fully explored. The judge knew this. He also knew that denying the request would cement the assumption that the beginning did not matter. The courtroom waited. No one whispered. No one shifted. Even the soft sounds of movement had faded. Time stretched in a way that felt unnatural, like a held breath that refused to release. Marcus felt suspended between two versions of his future. One where nothing changed. One where something finally slowed down enough to look back. The judge lowered his eyes to the bench, then raised them again. "This court," he said slowly, "has an obligation to consider relevant evidence, even if it complicates proceedings." The prosecutor exhaled through his nose, barely perceptible. The defense attorney's shoulders eased just a fraction. The judge continued, careful, deliberate. "If there is footage that captures the initiation of this interaction, it deserves review." The room did not erupt. It did not react at all. It simply waited, because everyone understood that whatever came next would speak louder than anything said so far. The judge's decision did not arrive with finality. It arrived with responsibility. Once the words were spoken, the room did not relax. It tightened. The weight shifted from argument to anticipation, and that weight settled on every person present. The prosecutor nodded once, signaling acceptance without surrender. He turned slightly toward the clerk, requesting the footage be retrieved. His movements were controlled, professional, but his earlier certainty had narrowed. This was no longer a clean narrative moving forward. It was a pause that forced the past back into the room. The defense attorney remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, as if anchoring himself to the opportunity before it slipped away. Then he sat down carefully, hands folded, eyes fixed on the screen that would soon light up again. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He had learned not to trust momentum until it became undeniable. Marcus felt the room change before he fully understood why. The silence was different now. It was not the silence of inevitability. It was the silence of waiting. His breathing slowed without his permission. He stared straight ahead, afraid that any reaction might be seen as guilt or worse, desperation. He did not look back at his mother. He did not look toward Keanu. He stayed exactly where he was suspended. His mother's eyes remained closed. Her shoulders rose slightly with each shallow breath. She pressed her lips together, not trusting them to stay still if she opened her eyes. For weeks, she had prepared herself for loss. She had learned how to function with dread sitting permanently in her chest. Now something else tried to enter that space, and she did not know how to hold it safely. A clerk moved toward the side door, footsteps echoing softly against the polished floor. The sound felt too loud. Heads followed the movement briefly, then returned to stillness. No one spoke. Even the judge leaned back again, hands resting calmly, gaze steady but distant. Time stretched in strange ways. Seconds felt longer than minutes had earlier. The air seemed thicker, harder to move through. Marcus noticed details he had ignored before. The hum of the lights, the faint creak of wood as someone adjusted their weight, and then froze. The subtle click of a pen being set down. Keanu sat motionless in the back row, hands resting on his knees, eyes forward. He did not lean in. He did not scan the room. He waited, trusting that the truth did not need to be chased once it had been invited in. Whatever happened next was no longer in his control. He had done what he came to do. The guard sat with his arms folded, jaw set. He stared ahead, expression unreadable. He did not look at the screen. He did not look at Marcus. He focused on nothing in particular, as if bracing for something he could not yet name. The judge checked the time once, then folded his hands again. He did not rush the process. He did not fill the silence with commentary. The court was holding its breath, and he allowed it to. This pause mattered. It mattered because nothing was being argued, nothing was being shaped, nothing was being interpreted yet. For the first time that day, the room was simply waiting to see. The minutes passed without announcement, without warning. No one checked a phone, no one shifted to ease discomfort. The courtroom existed in a suspended state, as if any movement might disturb the fragile pause that had finally taken shape. Marcus felt the strain in his legs, the ache in his lower back, but he did not move. He had learned that stillness could be mistaken for control. He held onto it now, anchoring himself in place. His thoughts raced, but his face remained neutral. He did not dare imagine what the footage might show. Imagination had hurt him before. Behind him, his mother slowly opened her eyes, then closed them again. The effort felt too heavy. She folded her hands, tighter nails, pressing into skin, grounding herself in sensation. Whatever was coming, she wanted to meet it without collapsing. She had promised herself that much. The defense attorney glanced once toward the side door, then forced his eyes back to the front. He knew better than to anticipate. Anticipation made disappointment sharper. He focused instead on breathing evenly, preparing himself to respond no matter what appeared on the screen. The prosecutor remained composed, but his fingers tapped once against the table before stilling. It was the only sign that the pause unsettled him. He had built his case carefully. He had trusted the footage he chose. Now he waited to see whether something outside that frame would complicate what had felt complete. The judge watched the doorway with calm attention. He did not hurry the process. He understood the gravity of waiting. Sometimes justice required speed, sometimes it required restraint. This moment demanded the latter. Finally, the door opened. A clerk stepped inside carrying a small device and a folder. The sound of the door closing behind him echoed softly louder than it should have been. Heads lifted, spines straightened. The air shifted again. The clerk moved toward the bench, placing the device carefully where it could be connected. The judge nodded once, signaling readiness. No one spoke. No one breathed easily, because whatever that camera showed or did not show would soon replace assumption with something far more dangerous. Clarity. The screen flickered once, then came to life. At first, nothing seemed remarkable. The image was grainy, slightly tilted, the colors washed thin by age and cheap equipment. The angle was low, closer to eye level than the overhead footage shown earlier. A narrow slice of the store filled the frame. The snack aisle. Boxes stacked unevenly. A strip of tile floor. No dramatic motion. Just space. Then the guard entered the frame. He approached from the left, walking with purpose, not haste. His shoulders were squared, his attention fixed forward. The camera did not capture his face clearly, but his direction was unmistakable. He was moving toward the end of the aisle, toward someone just outside the edge of the frame. A second later, Marcus stepped into view. He was holding a loaf of bread. His posture was closed, shoulders slightly hunched, feet angled inward. He was not moving quickly. He was standing still. The guard closed the distance. The camera showed the moment clearly enough that no narration was needed. The guard stepped into the aisle, narrowing the space. He shifted his body sideways, blocking the path forward. The aisle that already looked tight became confined. Marcus paused. There it was. The pause. A full second passed. Maybe two. In that silence, the truth lived plainly on the screen. Marcus did not advance. He leaned back slightly. His foot slid half a step behind him. His free hand lifted instinctively, not clenched, not raised, just uncertain. The guard spoke. The audio was faint, indistinct, but the body language carried tone. The guard's hand lifted palm forward, then pressed lightly against Marcus's chest or shoulder area. Not a shove, a contact, an assertion of space. Marcus reacted after that. His body moved backward as the contact happened. His shoulders tensed. His foot caught on the uneven tile or a box edge. The balance broke. In the scramble that followed, arms moved, bodies collided, and the guard fell hard out of frame. The video ended seconds later. No dramatic music, no commentary, just the quiet hum of the courtroom as the screen went dark. No one spoke. The difference between this footage and everything shown before was immediate and undeniable. The beginning was no longer missing. It was visible. The approach, the block, the contact, the reaction. The order was clear. Marcus had not initiated the physical exchange. He had responded to it. The judge leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the now dark screen. He did not ask a question. He did not need to. The sequence had answered it. Marcus felt something break loose in his chest. Not relief, not joy, shock. The kind that comes when reality finally matches what you have been holding alone for too long. He kept his face still, but his hands trembled faintly where they rested. Behind him, his mother covered her mouth with one hand, the other gripping the bench. Tears ran silently down her cheeks, but she did not move. She did not want to miss a second of what she had just seen. The guard shifted in his seat. His arms previously folded dropped to his sides. His shoulders stiffened. His gaze stayed forward, fixed on nothing. The certainty that had framed his testimony moments earlier no longer held. The prosecutor remained standing, eyes on the screen, jaw set. He said nothing, because for the first time, the truth in this case was no longer a matter of interpretation. It was visible. The judge did not look away from the screen when the footage ended. He remained still, as if allowing the image to linger longer than it physically could. In that stillness, the courtroom absorbed what it had just witnessed, each person recalibrating their understanding in silence. The prosecutor finally lowered himself into his chair. There was no objection, no attempt to reframe what had been shown. His hands rested flat on the table, fingers spread slightly as if grounding himself. The case he had built so carefully now sat beside him, intact in structure, but hollow at its core. The order of events he had relied on had been reversed not by argument, but by sight. Marcus felt the shift before anyone spoke. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The weight pressing down on his shoulders loosened just enough for him to breathe more fully. He stared at the dark screen, replaying the moment in his head, stunned by how ordinary it looked. The guard stepping in, the pause, the contact. It was exactly how he remembered it. Seeing it there undeniable made his throat tighten. He had not imagined it. He had not exaggerated it. He had not been wrong. His lawyer leaned toward him slightly, not to speak, just to be present. For the first time since this ordeal began, he did not look like a man managing damage. He looked like a man standing on solid ground. The guard shifted again, this time more noticeably. His jaw clenched, his back straightened. He stared straight ahead, refusing to look at the judge, the screen, or Marcus. The confidence he had carried earlier had nowhere to go now. The camera had captured what words could not protect. The judge finally cleared his throat. The sound cut through the silence cleanly. He glanced once toward the clerk, then toward both tables. His expression was controlled, but something had changed behind it. The case was no longer theoretical. It was no longer built on inference. The court had just witnessed the initiation of contact. Marcus's mother lowered her hand from her mouth, tears still falling freely. She pressed her palm against her chest, feeling her heart race. For weeks, she had tried to explain to people that her son had stepped back, not forward. That he had been cornered, that he had been scared. No one had listened. Now the room had seen it for itself. Keanu sat quietly in the back row, his posture unchanged. He did not search the room for reaction. He did not watch the guard or the prosecutor. His eyes remained on the judge. He knew the footage had done what words alone could not. It had restored sequence. And sequence, once restored, changed everything. The judge leaned back slowly, hands coming together. He did not speak yet. But the courtroom understood something profound had just occurred. The story that had carried Marcus to the edge of conviction had collapsed not with noise or drama, but with clarity. And there was no way to put it back together the same way again. The judge broke the silence with a question that carried no emotion and no hesitation. Before the fall, he said, looking directly at the security guard, "Did you initiate physical contact with the defendant?" The guard straightened immediately. His answer came fast, almost automatic. He said he did not believe he had. He said his intention was to maintain order. He said he was responding to a perceived threat. The words sounded familiar, rehearsed, shaped by policy and repetition. The judge did not interrupt. He let the answer settle, then asked again, slower this time, more precise. "In the footage we just reviewed, the judge said your hand appears to make contact before the defendant reacts. Can you explain that sequence?" This time the guard paused. It was brief but noticeable. His eyes shifted slightly. When he spoke again, his language changed. He said the contact was minimal. He said it was instinctive. He said it was meant to guide, not to restrain. He emphasized that it was not forceful. Each word narrowed the claim he had made moments earlier. The judge nodded once and continued. "Did you block the aisle intentionally?" The guard hesitated again. He said he was positioning himself to monitor the situation. He said the aisle was narrow. He said the movement was unintentional. His voice remained steady, but certainty no longer anchored it. His answers adjusted subtly, reshaping themselves around the footage, that had already spoken. The courtroom felt it. Not a dramatic shift, but a structural one. The authority that had framed the case from the beginning was now responding instead of leading. The prosecutor stood to redirect, stepping in smoothly. He acknowledged the footage while attempting to soften its impact. He reminded the court that grainy video could be misleading. He emphasized the guard's injury. He spoke about the difficulty of interpreting intent from partial angles. His argument was reasonable, carefully constructed, but it no longer matched what the room had seen. The judge turned back to the screen and referenced specific moments: the approach, the narrowing of space, the pause before contact. He did not accuse the guard. He asked him to reconcile his testimony with the visual sequence. Each question was simple. Each one carried weight. The defense attorney rose again, and this time his posture was different. He was no longer cautious. He was anchored. He spoke clearly, walking the court through the footage frame by frame. He pointed out that the defendant stepped back, that there was no forward motion. That contact occurred before reaction. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. Marcus felt something shift inside him as the words aligned with the image still fresh in his mind. For the first time since his arrest, the version of events being spoken aloud matched the truth he had carried alone. His shoulders loosened, his chin lifted slightly almost without his awareness. The room felt different now. The case was no longer driven by assumption. Authority was no longer uncontested. The narrative that had once felt inevitable was beginning to fracture under its own weight. Power had not disappeared. It had changed direction. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair. Fingers interlaced his gaze, moving with intention across the room. He looked at the prosecutor, then at the defense attorney, and finally at Marcus himself. This was no longer a question of presentation. It was a question of responsibility. Based on the footage we've reviewed, the judge said evenly, the court must reassess how this interaction escalated. The prosecutor rose again, but his confidence had changed shape. He acknowledged that the guard had approached first. He acknowledged that contact occurred before the defendant reacted. But he argued that escalation could still be mutual. That fear could provoke force. That intent did not always require initiation. His words were careful, deliberate, and legally sound. They just did not land the way they had before. The defense attorney stood immediately, voice steady, posture grounded. He did not attack. He clarified. He reminded the court that the charge required proof of assault, not reaction. He emphasized that the footage showed retreat, not advance. That the defendant's movement came after contact, not before. That fear and self-protection were not crimes. The judge listened without interruption, then turned back to the guard. Watching the footage now, the judge asked, "Would you handle that interaction differently?" The guard's jaw tightened. He paused longer this time. When he answered, his voice was quieter. "Possibly," he said. With hindsight, it was not a confession. It did not need to be. The acknowledgement carried enough weight on its own. Marcus felt his breath deepen. He stood a little straighter without realizing it. His eyes lifted fully, now meeting the front of the courtroom instead of the floor. He was not staring anyone down. He was simply present. For the first time, he did not feel like a silhouette defined by accusation. The jury watched him differently too, not with suspicion, but attention. The labels that had followed him into the room began to loosen, replaced by sequence, context, and human scale. The judge spoke again, his tone firm but controlled. "This footage does not depict an assault initiated by the defendant," he said. "It depicts an escalation that follows physical contact initiated by security personnel." The words settled into the room quietly, but their impact was immediate. The foundation of the charge shifted beneath everyone's feet. Marcus's mother released a breath that trembled as it left her body. Tears streamed freely now, her hands pressed together, not in fear, but relief. She did not look away. She wanted to remember this moment exactly as it was. Keanu remained seated in the back row, still and unobtrusive. He did not look toward Marcus. He did not seek acknowledgement. His role had already ended when the truth was allowed into the room. The courtroom had changed. Not because someone argued louder, not because someone demanded authority, but because the evidence once fully seen had corrected the balance. For the first time since the case began, Marcus was no longer being described by others. He was being understood, and the power in the room now reflected that truth. The judge did not rush the decision. He looked down at his notes once more, not because he needed clarification, but because gravity demanded a pause. The courtroom remained silent, every person aware that what came next would not simply end a case, but redraw a life. The judge lifted his head, his expression composed, steady, free of drama. Based on the evidence presented, he said evenly, and after reviewing all available footage, this court finds that the charge as filed is not supported. The words did not echo, they settled. The video evidence clearly shows that the defendant did not initiate physical contact. The judge continued, it shows escalation following contact initiated by security personnel. That distinction is critical. Marcus stood still, unsure whether his body was allowed to respond. His mind struggled to keep pace with the words. Not supported, did not initiate, critical. They sounded unreal, like language from another world. The court therefore dismisses the charge, the judge said, effective immediately. That was it. No gavel strike, no raised voice, no dramatic pause designed for impact. Just truth delivered plainly, firmly, without ceremony. For a moment, nothing happened. The courtroom did not erupt. No one clapped, no one spoke. Relief did not announce itself loudly. It arrived quietly like breath, returning after being held too long. Marcus's knees weakened slightly. He caught himself grounding his feet against the floor. Free. The word did not register all at once. It unfolded slowly, cautiously, as if afraid to be mistaken. His shoulders sagged not from exhaustion, but release. The weight he had been carrying since the night at the store did not vanish. It loosened, enough to stand again. Behind him, his mother broke, not loudly, not theatrically. Her body folded forward as the strength she had forced herself to hold finally gave way. One hand covered her mouth, the other pressed against her chest as sobs shook her quietly. Weeks of fear poured out in silence. Fear she had swallowed whole so her son would not see it. Fear that had followed her into every shift, every bus ride, every sleepless night. The defense attorney exhaled deeply and closed his eyes for a brief moment. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply allowed himself to acknowledge that justice had occurred, not perfectly, not easily, but enough. The prosecutor gathered his papers slowly. There was no protest, no appeal announced in anger. The case had ended where it should have ended. He accepted it professionally, understanding that evidence had spoken louder than narrative. The guard remained seated, expression tight, gaze fixed forward. He did not look at Marcus. He did not look at the judge. He stared ahead, absorbing a reality that had shifted beyond his control. The judge addressed the court one final time, reminding everyone that dismissal was not absolution of harm, but recognition of truth. His words were measured procedural, but carried quiet weight. Marcus finally turned his head just slightly enough to see his mother through his peripheral vision. He did not rush to her. He did not speak. He simply stood there present, letting the moment exist without interruption. The system for once had stopped. It had paused long enough to look. And because of that pause, a life that had nearly been defined by a single cropped moment was allowed to continue unbroken. It took several seconds before Marcus fully understood that he was no longer required to stand there. The judge's words had ended the case, but his body had not yet caught up. He remained still, eyes forward, as if waiting for someone to tell him what to do next. When his lawyer finally touched his arm gently, Marcus turned confused, and the attorney nodded once. It was over. Marcus faced his mother then. She looked smaller than he remembered, folded inward by relief that had nowhere else to go. Her shoulders shook as she tried to steady her breathing, tears spilling freely now that she no longer needed to be strong. Marcus stepped toward her, slow at first, then faster when she reached out. She wrapped her arms around him tightly, pressing her face into his chest, holding him as if she were afraid the moment might still be taken away. Marcus stood there, arms around her, feeling the tremor of her sobs and realizing how close he had come to losing this simple act. Around them, the courtroom returned to motion. Papers were gathered, chairs shifted, quiet instructions were given. The machinery of the system resumed its rhythm, already moving on to the next case, the next name, the next set of facts. But for Marcus and his mother, time had narrowed to this single point of release. The defense attorney stepped back respectfully, giving them space. His job was done, but he remained nearby, watchful, as if guarding the boundary between freedom and disbelief. He knew how fragile moments like this could feel. The judge rose briefly, then exited through the side door without ceremony. There was no lingering, no acknowledgement of the emotional gravity he had just presided over. That, too, was part of the system. Justice delivered did not require applause. It required finality. Keanu stood quietly in the back row as people began to file out. He waited until the room had thinned before moving. He did not approach Marcus. He did not introduce himself. He understood that this moment belonged to the boy and his mother, not to the person who had helped reopen the frame. He slipped out as quietly as he had arrived. Marcus noticed none of this. His world had narrowed again, but this time around something gentler. He felt lighter, but also strangely exposed, as if the weight he had carried had been holding him together. Freedom felt unfamiliar. He did not yet know how to live inside it. As they walked out of the courtroom together, his mother's hand found his and held tight. Neither of them spoke. Words would come later when they were safe enough to be spoken. For now, silence was enough. The system had nearly taken everything from a boy who had done nothing wrong. It had come dangerously close to defining him by a moment that did not belong to him. But this time it stopped. Not because it wanted to, because someone insisted that it look again. And in that pause, a future was returned. The courtroom emptied the way it always did, quietly and without ceremony. People gathered their things. Adjusted jackets spoke in low voices about schedules and parking and lunch plans. The machinery of the day moved on with practiced indifference, as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred. Marcus stood near the defense table longer than necessary, his mother still beside him, her hand wrapped tightly around his. He nodded when the attorney said a few final words about paperwork and next steps and sealing records. Marcus heard them, but they did not fully register. His attention kept drifting elsewhere. He scanned the room. At first, he did not know what he was looking for, only that there was something unfinished inside him, a feeling that demanded direction. His eyes moved instinctively toward the back row, toward the corner where the quiet man had stood up when no one else had. The seat was empty. Marcus frowned, slightly unsure. He looked again, slower this time, tracing the rows, searching for the familiar posture. The dark jacket, the stillness that had somehow carried so much weight. There was nothing there, just polished wood and scattered papers left behind. He turned to his mother. She was wiping her face with a tissue, trying to steady herself. Exhaustion settling in now that the fear was gone. Marcus hesitated, then leaned toward her. "Where did he go?" he asked softly. She followed his gaze, scanning the room briefly. She shook her head. "I don't know, baby," she said. "I didn't see him leave." Marcus felt a strange tightening in his chest. It was not disappointment exactly, it was confusion. He had imagined this moment differently. He had imagined walking up to the man who had stood when it mattered. He had imagined saying thank you. Not the kind of thank you people said out of politeness, but the kind that carried the weight of a life returned. He wanted to ask why. Why a stranger would risk speaking up. Why someone with nothing to gain would insert himself into a moment that could have easily passed without notice. Marcus had grown up learning that people rarely did things without reason. Kindness usually came with conditions. Help often came with expectations. This had come with nothing at all. He took a few steps toward the back of the room, careful, tentative, as if afraid the moment might still unravel. His mother stayed where she was, watching him, understanding without being told. Marcus reached the last row and stopped. The chair was still warm. That small detail struck him harder than anything else. Keanu Reeves had been here moments ago, close enough to change everything. And now he was gone. A clerk passed by collecting folders. Marcus opened his mouth to ask, then closed it again. He did not want to sound foolish. He did not want to draw attention. He already felt exposed enough. He stood there for another second, then another, finally accepting what the room was telling him. The man who had helped save his future had left without waiting for thanks, without waiting for recognition, without waiting for anything at all. Marcus turned back toward his mother slowly. His gratitude did not disappear. If anything, it deepened. But it mixed now with something unfamiliar. A quiet disorientation, the kind that comes when something extraordinary happens, without explanation. As they walked toward the exit together, Marcus glanced back one last time. The back row remained empty, and somehow that absence spoke louder than words ever could. Outside the courtroom, the hallway felt wider than it had before the ceiling, higher the air, easier to breathe. Voices echoed from other rooms. Shoes clicked against the floor. Life continued at its usual pace, indifferent to what had just changed for Marcus. He stood there for a moment, letting people pass his eyes, still searching, instinctively even now, for a familiar figure that would not appear. His mother squeezed his hand gently. "It's okay," she said, though she was not sure what she meant by it. Okay that the case was over. Okay that he was free. Okay that the man who helped them had vanished. Some things did not need answers right away. Marcus nodded, but his attention drifted again. He replayed the moment in his mind. The calm voice, the respectful tone, the way the man had stood without asking permission from anyone except the judge, the way he had sat back down afterward as if nothing important had happened. Marcus realized something slowly, like a truth rising to the surface. Maybe he had not stayed because staying would have changed the meaning of what he did. Marcus had grown up around transactions, favors that expected loyalty, help that demanded gratitude, rescue that came with a reminder of who held power. What had happened in that courtroom felt different. It felt clean. The absence now made that difference clearer. They walked toward the exit doors together. Sunlight filtered in through tall windows, catching dust in the air. Marcus paused just before stepping outside, turning once more to look down the hallway behind them. It was empty of anyone he recognized. For a brief moment, disappointment flickered. He wanted to say the words out loud. He wanted to look the man in the eye and tell him that his voice had mattered, that his memory had mattered, that his decision to stand had changed everything. But another thought followed close behind. Maybe the man already knew. Marcus exhaled slowly and stepped into the daylight with his mother beside him. The city sounded the same as it always had. Cars passed, people talked. Nothing announced that a life had just been handed back. As they walked away from the courthouse, Marcus felt both lighter and unsettled. Gratitude filled him, but so did questions. Why him? Why that night? Why someone like Keanu Reeves would care enough to interrupt a system that rarely listened? He did not have answers. What he had was a future that had nearly been taken from him, and the knowledge that somewhere out there was a person who believed that truth did not need applause to be worth defending. That belief stayed with Marcus as they disappeared into the crowd, long after the courtroom doors closed behind them. The defense attorney returned to his office late that afternoon, long after the courthouse had emptied and the adrenaline of the hearing had faded. His tie was loosened. His jacket hung over the back of the chair instead of being placed neatly where it belonged. The room felt quieter than usual, as if it too was processing what had almost happened. He set his briefcase down, exhaled, and stood still for a moment. Wins like this were rare. Not because innocence was rare, but because the system rarely paused long enough to notice it. Today had been different. Today had required someone outside the machinery to intervene calmly and without demand. The attorney moved toward his desk, already thinking about the next case waiting in his inbox. Another file, another name, another story that would need defending against momentum. He placed his hand on the edge of the desk and stopped, Something was there that had not been there that morning. A single business card sat near the center of the desk, positioned carefully as if it had been placed with intention rather than dropped in passing. It was plain, white cardstock, no logo, no color, no embellishment, just a name printed cleanly in black. Keanu Reeves. No title followed, no company, no phone number beyond a single line of digits, no email address screaming for attention, nothing that suggested importance beyond the name itself. The attorney picked it up slowly, turning it over between his fingers. The weight of it felt disproportionate to its size. He knew immediately who it was from. There was no need to ask. On the back, written in steady, deliberate handwriting, was a short message. Not a quote, not a slogan, not advice dressed up as wisdom. Just a sentence. Don't give up on children who never had a chance. The attorney read it once, then again. He sat down heavily, the chair creaking beneath him. The words landed differently than he expected. They did not feel sentimental. They did not feel performative. They felt like a reminder meant for someone who already understood but needed to be told anyway. He thought about Marcus, about how close the boy had come to being swallowed whole by a version of events that did not belong to him, about how easily the case could have ended differently if one person had not remembered a detail others dismissed. The attorney leaned back, staring at the ceiling. He had chosen this work years ago, believing he could help correct imbalance. Over time, the grind had worn that belief thin. Case after case chipped away at it. Losses that felt inevitable. Wins that felt temporary. Systems that moved faster than conscience. That card did not pretend to fix any of that. It simply acknowledged it. The attorney turned the card over again, tracing the edge with his thumb. The message was not a command. It did not ask him to be better or stronger or more hopeful. It asked him not to forget why he had started. He thought about how easily people like Marcus were labeled before being heard, how often the phrase trouble followed them like a shadow, how quickly the system learned to see patterns instead of people. The card sat quietly in his hand, saying nothing more. But it did not need to, because the reminder it carried was heavier than advice. It was a responsibility. And it stayed with him long after he placed the card carefully back on the desk, not filed away, not hidden, but left exactly where he would see it again the next morning. The attorney remained seated long after the office lights outside his window began to dim. Traffic hummed below, distant and constant, reminding him that the world did not pause just because one case had gone right. He turned the card over again, reading the sentence slowly, letting each word take its place. Don't give up on children who never had a chance. It was not written like a message meant to impress. There was no flourish, no attempt to sound profound. That was what made it difficult to ignore. It sounded like something said quietly after everything else had already been stripped away. He thought back to the courtroom, to the moment when momentum had almost swallowed Marcus whole, to how close he himself had come to accepting that dismissal of the second camera as a lost cause. He had told himself it was procedural, strategic, reasonable, but reasonable had nearly cost a boy his future. The attorney closed his eyes, briefly replaying the hearing from start to finish. He realized something uncomfortable. Without that intervention, he would have walked out of court, knowing he had done his job correctly and still failed completely. The system would have moved on, and so would he. That thought sat heavy in his chest. He opened his eyes and looked again at the card resting on the desk. The message was not telling him to save everyone. It was telling him not to surrender before the fight had even finished, not to confuse exhaustion with realism, not to mistake procedure for justice. He thought about the cases waiting in his file drawer, names he had already begun to categorize unconsciously. Long shots, hard sells, clients with backgrounds that made juries stiffen before testimony even began, children who had grown up learning how to brace instead of dream. The card did not promise those cases would end differently. It only reminded him that giving up early guaranteed they would not. He slid the card slightly to the side of his desk, placing it where his eyes would fall naturally when he sat down each morning. Not pinned to a board, not framed, just present, quiet, unavoidable. Outside, the sky darkened completely. The office building across the street turned off its lights, one floor at a time. The attorney finally stood, slipping his jacket back on, turning off the lamp. Before leaving, he glanced once more at the card. He did not smile. He did not sigh. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging a truth he had always known, but sometimes needed help remembering. Then he turned off the light and closed the door behind him, carrying the weight of that reminder into whatever case would come next. The attorney read the sentence again the next morning. He had arrived earlier than usual, the building still quiet, the hallway lights humming softly. Coffee sat untouched on the corner of his desk, as his eyes returned almost automatically to the business card, lying exactly where he had left it. The words looked the same as they had the night before, plain, unadorned, impossible to misunderstand. Don't give up on children who never had a chance. He read it slowly this time, not as a message, but as a mirror. The phrase did not flatter him. It did not praise what he had done. It asked something of him, something ongoing, something inconvenient. He thought about how often the system encouraged surrender dressed up as efficiency, plea deals offered as mercy, shortcuts framed as realism, files closed, and not because truth had been reached, but because energy had been depleted. He had participated in that culture more times than he liked to admit. Not out of cruelty, out of fatigue. The card made no allowance for that fatigue. Later that afternoon, Marcus returned to the office with his mother. Paperwork needed signatures, records needed sealing, formalities that existed to clean up what had nearly become permanent damage. Marcus sat quietly in the chair across from the desk, his posture still cautious, as if the room might yet change its mind. The attorney finished explaining the documents, then hesitated. He reached for the business card. "I want to show you something," he said, sliding it gently across the desk. Marcus looked down. He recognized the name immediately. His chest tightened. He turned the card over with careful fingers and read the words on the back. Once, then again. He did not speak at first. His mother leaned closer, reading over his shoulder. Her breath caught softly as she took in the sentence. She pressed a hand to her mouth, emotion rising, quickly unguarded this time. Marcus finally looked up. "He wrote this," he asked quietly. The attorney nodded. "He left it for me." After the hearing, Marcus lowered his gaze back to the card. The words felt heavier in his hands than they had on the page. They explained something he had been trying to understand since leaving the courtroom. Not why the man had stood, but how. This was not about him alone. Children who never had a chance. Marcus felt the phrase settle inside him, reshaping memories he had long carried without language. Teachers who expected less, officers who watched more closely, store clerks who followed him between aisles, a lifetime of being evaluated before being known. He realized something quietly without drama. What had almost happened to him was not unique. It was common. And that was what made the words on the card feel less like comfort and more like responsibility. The attorney watched Marcus closely, seeing the shift happen in real time. This was not relief turning into celebration. It was relief turning into awareness. "This doesn't end with your case," the attorney said gently. "It's a reminder. For me, for anyone who chooses to listen." Marcus nodded slowly. He folded the card back into his hands, then paused. "Can I keep this?" he asked. The attorney smiled faintly. "I think that's where it belongs." Marcus slipped the card carefully into his pocket, as if it might tear if handled roughly. He did not know yet what it meant for him, only that it mattered. The words were no longer just written. They were carried. On the bus ride home, Marcus kept his hand in his jacket pocket, fingers resting against the edge of the card. He did not take it out. He did not reread it. He just needed to know it was there. The words had already settled into him, doing their work quietly. The city moved past the window in familiar fragments. Corner stores, bus stops, groups of kids laughing too loudly, trying to claim space in a world that often ignored them. Marcus watched them differently now. He saw himself in their posture, in the way some of them stayed alert, even while joking, scanning for threats that had nothing to do with the moment. children who never had a chance. He understood now that the phrase was not an accusation. It was an acknowledgement. It named something most people preferred to leave unnamed because naming it made responsibility unavoidable. At home, his mother watched him carefully as he set his jacket down. She had seen him change in small ways since the hearing. Not lighter exactly, more awake. When he finally pulled the card out and placed it on the kitchen table, she sat across from him and read it again. "This man," she said softly, "he didn't save you because you were special." Marcus nodded. "He saved me because I wasn't." The truth of it did not sting. It clarified. That night, Marcus lay awake longer than usual. The fear that had kept him restless for weeks was gone, but something else had taken its place. A sense of direction he had never felt before. He thought about the moment in the aisle, about how close his life had come to narrowing permanently, about how many other kids never got a second look. He realized the card was not asking him to be grateful forever. It was asking him to notice. In the days that followed, the attorney found himself reaching for the card more often than he expected. Not during victories, but during difficult conversations, when clients seemed impossible, when judges grew impatient, when shortcuts tempted him with the promise of rest. The words did not change the outcome of every case, but they changed how long he stayed in the fight. Marcus returned to school quietly. There was no announcement, no apology from the world. Some teachers looked at him with curiosity, others avoided the subject altogether. Marcus carried on, but something in his posture had shifted. He lifted his head more often. He spoke when spoken to. He did not rush to disappear. The phrase traveled with him, invisible but present. It reminded him that surviving was not the same as being finished. It reminded the attorney that defending children was not about winning every case, but about refusing to stop looking. And somewhere between those two realizations, the message completed its purpose. It became more than words. It became a line that could not be crossed again. A quiet promise carried forward even when the system preferred not to notice. Months passed quietly at first, then all at once. Life did not reset itself just because the court had done the right thing. There were no sudden celebrations, no dramatic turning points that announced a fresh start. What Marcus received instead was something more fragile and more valuable: time, space, the ability to keep going. He returned to school in the middle of a semester, walking the same hallways that had once felt hostile. Some faces looked away. Others looked longer than necessary, curiosity lingering where judgment had once lived. Teachers treated him carefully, as if unsure which version of him they were allowed to see. Marcus noticed it all, but he did not react. He had learned patience the hard way. Sitting in class again felt strange. The desks seemed smaller, the rooms louder. His focus came and went. Some days a raised voice in the hallway made his shoulders tense before he could stop himself. Some nights he woke from dreams where the aisle narrowed and there was nowhere left to step back. Healing, he learned, was not a straight line. After school, Marcus worked part-time at a small grocery store several blocks from home. The job was simple: stocking shelves, sweeping floors, carrying boxes that made his arms ache in a way that felt honest. The manager watched him closely at first, cautious but fair. Marcus showed up early, stayed late when asked, kept his head down. Trust was built quietly, one shift at a time. At home, his mother smiled more often, though worry still lived behind her eyes. She worked fewer double shifts now. They cooked together in the evenings, talking about small things: school assignments, work schedules, what to make for dinner. Neither of them rushed into conversations about the trial. Some experiences needed distance before they could be spoken without reopening wounds. Marcus carried the memory with him everywhere. Not like a burden, but like a scar. A reminder of how close his life had come to narrowing permanently. He thought about it while stacking cans at work, while riding the bus, while sitting in class staring at the clock. The memory did not fade. It settled. Sometimes, when the weight felt heavier, Marcus reached into his pocket and felt the edge of the business card. He did not read it anymore. He did not need to. The words had embedded themselves in him. He remembered the moment the man stood, not the name, not the recognition that had rippled through the courtroom. The calm, the patience, the way he had spoken without anger or urgency, as if truth did not need to be forced to be heard. Marcus realized that memory had reshaped something inside him. He had grown up believing that power was loud, that authority demanded space, that survival required shrinking. What he had seen that day suggested something else, that sometimes the strongest thing a person could do was stand quietly and refuse to let a story end incorrectly. Marcus did not know what he wanted his future to look like yet. College felt distant. Long-term plans still felt fragile. But for the first time, imagining a future did not feel foolish. It felt allowed. He was not magically healed, but he was here, and that mattered more than anything else. Some mornings, Marcus woke up before his alarm, lying still and listening to the sounds of the apartment. His mother moving in the kitchen, the hum of traffic outside, ordinary sounds that had once felt fragile, as if they could be taken away without warning. Now they grounded him. They reminded him that his life was still unfolding. He began to do better in school, not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily. A teacher noticed his effort and offered extra help after class. Marcus accepted, even though asking for help still felt unfamiliar. He learned that effort did not erase the past, but it did build something new on top of it. Slowly, confidence returned in small pieces. A completed assignment, a passing grade. A moment where he raised his hand and did not immediately regret it. At work, the manager stopped hovering. Trust had replaced caution. Marcus was given more responsibility, small things at first. Closing a register, training a new hire. Each task carried a quiet message. You are reliable. You belong here. He absorbed those messages carefully, afraid to rush them, but grateful all the same. There were still moments when the memory surged without warning. A security guard at a different store watching him too closely. A sudden confrontation between strangers on the street. In those moments, Marcus felt his body react before his thoughts could catch up. His heart raced. His jaw tightened. He learned to breathe through it to remind himself where he was, who he was now. He talked about the case once late at night, sitting at the kitchen table with his mother. Not the details, just the feeling of almost losing everything. She listened without interrupting, her hand resting over his. When he finished, she said only one thing. "You're still here." Marcus nodded. That was the truth he returned to again and again. Sometimes on the bus ride home, he thought about the man who had stood in the back row. He wondered where he was now, what he was doing, whether he ever thought about the boy whose life had nearly been erased by a cropped story. Marcus did not need answers. He carried the memory, instead letting it shape how he saw the world. He noticed injustice more quickly now. He noticed who was watched and who was trusted, who was given patience and who was given suspicion. He did not know yet what he would do with that awareness, but he knew he would not ignore it. Marcus stood a little taller these days, not because he felt invincible, but because he felt present, grounded, alive in a way he had not been before. His future was still uncertain, hard work still lay ahead, mistakes would still happen, but the door that had nearly closed on him remained open. And every step he took forward was a quiet act of defiance against the moment that had almost defined him. He remembered the man who stood when no one else did, and in remembering that, Marcus kept standing too. Justice does not always arrive with raised voices or dramatic entrances. It does not always announce itself with certainty or demand attention the moment it appears. Sometimes it sits quietly in the back row, unnoticed, waiting for the right moment to matter. In that courtroom, nothing extraordinary happened at first. The process moved the way it always did. Words were spoken. Assumptions were repeated. A young life edged closer to being defined by a story that was incomplete. No one in the room set out to do harm. No one declared injustice as their goal. And yet, without interruption, injustice would have happened anyway. That is how it often works. The most dangerous moments are not always the loud ones. They are the quiet moments where momentum replaces curiosity. where a cropped angle becomes a conclusion, where efficiency becomes more important than accuracy, where the beginning of a story is dismissed because it is inconvenient to examine. Marcus was nearly lost to one of those moments, not because the truth was hidden, but because it was ignored, not because evidence did not exist, but because it was labeled unclear and set aside. The system did what it was designed to do when no one asked it to slow down. What changed everything was not power. It was not authority. It was not reputation. It was a memory, a calm voice, a simple request for one more look. Keanu Reeves did not storm the courtroom. He did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. He did not demand justice. He respected the process enough to ask it to be complete. That was all it took. One person noticed the angle everyone else skipped. One person remembered the beginning when everyone else focused on the end. One person stood. And because of that, a young man walked out free, carrying a future that had almost been taken from him before it ever had the chance to begin. This story is not just about a courtroom. It is about how many lives are shaped by what we choose to see and what we choose to ignore. How many Marcus-like moments happen every day quietly without cameras, without famous names in the back row? How many assumptions harden into verdicts simply because no one pauses long enough to ask whether the frame is complete? Justice does not require perfection. It requires attention. It requires the willingness to question what feels obvious, to revisit what has already been labeled settled, to recognize that clarity often lives just outside the angle we were told to trust. Marcus's life did not change because someone shouted. It changed because someone listened, because someone remembered, because someone believed that a child who never had a chance was still worth the time it took to look again. That belief did not end in the courtroom. It moved forward with Marcus. It moved forward with his attorney. And now it moves forward with you. Because stories like this do not belong to the past. They are unfolding right now in places where no one expects them to matter. And the question is not whether injustice exists. The question is whether, when the moment comes, someone will be willing to stand quietly and ask for one more look. If you had been sitting in that room, would you have noticed what was missing? Not the obvious things, not the fall or the noise or the injury, but the moment before, the pause, the step back instead of forward, the angle that did not make it onto the screen everyone trusted. Most people believe justice fails because of malice, because someone lies, because someone abuses power intentionally. Sometimes that is true, but far more often justice fails because no one asks the second question. No one challenges the first assumption. No one slows the process down long enough to notice what was left out. That courtroom was full of reasonable people, trained people, people doing their jobs as they had been taught. And still, a young life almost disappeared into the machinery simply because the story felt complete enough. That is what should unsettle us. How many lives are shaped by ignored angles? How many futures are narrowed by unchallenged assumptions? How many children are labeled before they are understood? Marcus was not saved by a miracle. He was saved by attention, by someone who remembered that truth is often quieter than accusation, by someone who understood that asking for one more look is not disruption. It is responsibility. Most of us will never stand in a courtroom with a life hanging in the balance, but we stand in moments like this more often than we realize. In classrooms, in workplaces, in public spaces. In conversations where someone is being defined by a single moment, a single mistake, or a single version of a story. The question this story leaves us with is simple but uncomfortable. When the system moves forward too quickly, will you notice? When a story feels settled too soon, will you question it? When a child has never had a chance, will you still believe they deserve one? Keanu Reeves did not change the world that day. He changed one outcome, and that was enough. Because for Marcus, that outcome was everything. If this story moved, you take a moment to reflect. Have you ever seen a situation where the truth felt incomplete, but no one spoke up? Have you ever stayed silent because it felt easier or safer or not your place? And if you were in that room when the verdict felt inevitable and the air felt heavy, would you have stood too? Finally, tell us in the comments, do you believe most injustices come from cruelty or from indifference? And what other stories like this deserve a second look? If stories about quiet courage, overlooked truth, and second chances matter to you, stay with us. Subscribe, share your thoughts, and let us know what story you want to hear next. Because sometimes the smallest pause can change a life, and sometimes all justice needs is someone willing to ask for one more look.